Hey, welcome everyone. We're with another episode of Maximize Excellence. My name's Lori Harris, and I am going to be your host today. And I'm very, very honored and excited to have our guest, Aaron Simmons, with us today. Aaron is the professor of philosophy at Furman University, but he's better known for his varying roles as philosopher, author, mountain biker, fisherman, husband, and father. But let me tell you a little bit about him, though. So those roles will probably come out in today's conversation. He specializes in philosophy of religion, existentialism, and please forgive me if I stated that wrong, phenomenology, and is widely sought out speaker. He's published widely. I think he told me earlier 35 or so books, and authored or editor of numerous books. He's an award-winning teacher, and his essays published in many distinguished journals in philosophy and religious studies. Aaron is the former president of the Soren Kierkegaard Society in the United States, and he's the former president of South Carolina Society for Philosophy. And he currently sits on the executive board of the Society for Continental Philosophy and Theology. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Aaron Simmons.
Oh, Lori, thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here. The book numbers were a little inflated there. It's more like 13, but I'll take 35. I can tell your consulting skills, always lean into exaggeration. Sounds great to me. But and I apologize for all of the terms in my bio that require people to say, how do you pronounce this? I need to. My wife is a marketing director for Chick-fil-A, and she tells me all the time, like, we have got to work on your bio and make all of the words like monosyllabic things so that people can be excited to introduce you. It's like, oh, this guy. So you did a great job. But I'm so glad to be here.
Oh, I'm really, really excited. Before we get started, I just want to put a shout out to Dr. Tom Morris, another philosopher in this world. I always tease and say he's our modern day Aristotle and modern day philosopher. And he's great friends with you, Aaron. And I just happen to be in that same bucket from a different perspective and just respect him thoroughly. And he's the one that referred me to you. So I appreciate that. Thank you, Tom.
I appreciate Tom doing that. And he actually, for my new book, wrote the foreword for it. The book actually came out in his press, Wisdom Work, which was also an honor to work with him in a kind of boutique press way, which was a fantastic experience. And a shout out to Tom Morris, and really, really appreciate all the work that he's done to put us together and introduce me to so many other people.
So we are going to talk about this book today. And from my perspective, from my company's perspective, and we're going to talk about this book as it relates to leaders in our world, leaders in companies, leaders in organizations, leaders in business, leaders in groups. Let's say it that way as well, because we got leaders in all kinds of, from all kinds of realms in the world. And just really quick, Aaron, I'd love to read this. It says, what is worthy of your finitude? And I'm going to have you describe finitude in just a second. But in this book, there's this little brief paragraph here. You take us on a trip to the mountains to reflect on the meaning of life in a world too often defined by a quest for success that leaves us empty, alone, and anxious, which we often hear of leaders. You seek faithfulness outdoors with thinkers and artists from Aristotle to Kierkegaard. Help me out.
Sartre.
Yeah. And Anne Lamott and Kendrick Lamar to Donovan Woods. So lots and lots of great philosophy, which, by the way, was often the basis and foundation for leadership philosophy, leadership methods, leadership philosophy as well. And then you invite us to rethink what it means to make choices, to take risks, to be alone and silent while cultivating friendships, and to find our calling by facing our vulnerability. And I love that you use the word vulnerability because it means nothing but openness. In the end, you show us that faithfulness is more than a religious concept. It's about living a life of risk with direction. Living a life of risk with direction. That's leadership.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I told you before we started that one of the things that excites me about being able to speak with you today is this book. I mean, when you write a book for a broad audience, and this is the first of over a dozen books I've written. I mentioned all my others are unreadable academic nonsense. Do not recommend them to anybody unless you like really geek out about modal logic and stuff. But this book is written to a broad audience. I've had people come to my talks and book events from 16 years old to 85 years old, and all of them responding in really amazing ways. But the thought about why I'm stoked to think about this in the context of leadership is because philosophy is one of those terms, right? Which is where the book kind of gets housed. Well, it's a book of philosophy. Well, the problem is philosophy gets also pigeonholed as impractical, as irrelevant to life, as in many ways a distraction from the things that matter most. And though those things, like not living in your parents' basement at 40 and making sure you can pay your mortgage and these sorts of things, these are not unimportant, but they don't ultimately ground what matters about us as beings. And so what this book tries to do is invites all of us to think about who we are and where we're going and why it matters. And that's where then, as you mentioned, the kind of two key ideas about defining our selfhood is vulnerability and relationality. Yeah. And vulnerability, like you say, it means openness. It means, for me, the idea of the necessity of humility for any forward momentum. So the only way I can move forward is if I realize that I don't have everything figured out. My vulnerability is not just an exposure to other people. It also means that I'm fundamentally flawed in really important ways. And so for leaders to take seriously that vulnerability doesn't mean I don't know what I'm doing. Humility doesn't mean radical ignorance, right? It means more like C.S. Lewis defines it. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's just thinking of yourself less, right? Where I'm not the center of the narrative by which I see the world. I'm not ultimately the answer to everyone else's question. I'm not ultimately the authority structure that should anchor everyone else's conception of meaning, right? Mm-hmm. Even if I, run a Fortune 500 company, the people who do that well are the people who recognize, look, I've got some stuff I'm really good at, and I've got lots of other really good people who are good at other things. And only that humility to invite other people to form a team is where we move from humility to hospitality. And so we've got to say, hey, I need you. And if I don't need you, then I'm probably not understanding my own selfhood, my own identity very well. And that's where we go from this vulnerability to relationality. I stand always already in community with other people. And that's what then actually makes, I think, a more compelling model of human existence, of society, of democracy, and in particular of organizations whereby some people have to lead and other people have to lead and follow in other forms, right? And we can't navigate that. Right. We can't navigate that. So long as we think I've got everything figured out, I'm invulnerable, I'm at the apex of human existence. So this book is an encouragement for all of us to kind of rest easier in the importance of humility and then propel us into hospitality as a way of then working with others.
And why finitude? First of all, describe it. And why finitude?
Yeah, so the question of the book is to which faithfulness is my name for an answer, and then faithfulness gets unpacked in these humble hospitality sorts of ways. Finitude is, in my opinion, shorthand for the fact that our being limited not only in terms of knowledge, but also in terms of temporal duration, right? The fact is we're all gonna die. We perform and are bodies that break. None of us navigate the world free of suffering, free of illness. Right. And so finitude names all of that fact, right? It means that we are finite. We are not infinite in the sense that we do not admit of limitations, right? We are fundamentally limited. So why does that matter? Well, what's worthy of my finitude, I think, is the most central question to the history of philosophy. And it's the question all of my students ask and have asked for a decade. It's the question that I get asked when CEOs hear me talk and reach out and say, hey, can I have 15 minutes? I'm richer than God, but I've lost my family. Or I have everything anybody could want. I can't figure out why I should get out of bed tomorrow. Like, it's what I get asked by 80-year-olds who say, once I retired, I can't figure out why I matter to the world anymore. I mean, all of these different layers of the human experience are framed by, given that we don't have an infinite amount of time, it really matters what we do with the time we have. So what's worthy of my finitude is that point.
And therefore, I read your book 4 times, and I wrote in here, essential and distinguishing attribute.
Yeah. You are finite. And Todd May, a philosopher friend of mine, says that death is the most important fact about us.
Yes.
I think that's probably said a little bit more extreme than I'd put it. But what he's saying is exactly right. It's only because we don't have forever that the things we do matter. I mean, think about it. I can't play the cello. Maybe you're an amazing cellist, but like Yo-Yo Ma is an amazing cellist. And the reason that we know Yo-Yo Ma's name is because we're not that good. I mean, the reason we know Chick Corea's name as a pianist, the reason we know Alex Honnold as a rock climber, like all of these things are because not everybody can do the things that they've willed themselves to make possible. But if we literally had forever, all of us would have already climbed Mount Everest. And if we haven't, we'll get to it, right? Yeah. All of us would have performed the most difficult cello piece that has ever existed. And if not, we'll get to it. And the point is, so our life would become boring and it would become meaningless because there's now no risk involved in the decisions we make about how to spend our time. And that's where I want to kind of lean into.
And embodying that vulnerability.
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah.
I mountain bike all the time. And just this morning was mountain biking and took a corner, really hard. And my back tire kind of slid out from under me. And thankfully I didn't go down super hard. But, there's a couple scratches. And the fact is, mountain biking would lose all of its fun if it had absolutely no risk attending it. Now, I'm all for trying to minimize that risk so far as possible. I wear body armor. I wear full face helmets. I mean, I'm not interested. I have my friends, I want to go to lunch. I don't want to go to the urgent care. But at the same time, it's because there is risk involved that doing the things that we do on the mountain bike have the significance that they have. Because if I say, hey, there's a 50-foot rock jump, well, there's no way in heck I'm doing that. Mm-hmm. I know friends who will, because they're 26 and have different relationships to the world. They've also got better talent than me. But if all of us do it, and if we crash, we just hop up, notice nothing then becomes significant because everything's doable. The reason significance matters is because some stuff really comes with costs, and we've got to decide if those costs are worth it.
And in that as well, we are able to speak unarguably. We're able to absolutely own our curiosity of that and be able to optimize our talents and our motivation and our strengths within that and be able to have enjoyment, right? So this leads to all of that. One of the things that made me think about leadership as it relates to this is how you formulate and how you absolutely foundationally have faithfulness in that foundation. And before we go forward into everything else, because we talked about finitude, now I want to bring it all the way back. And, with this foundation of faithfulness and speak to that, because you do a great job in this book at keeping it. First of all, you definitely define it in a way that is personable, very humanistic, and you thread it throughout every chapter in this book so that when we realize finitude and we embrace it, accept it, it becomes something of high value
Mm.
And I see it in leaders all the time, and that faithfulness, and because it's so comprehensive, this is a word that's definitely loaded,
Oh
that
yeah.
I think you bring a lot of value to this. So talk about
No,
it.
I appreciate
This is
that.
really
Yeah. So I gave a talk. It was a TEDx talk. I don't know how many years ago, 6, 7 years ago. And that was the first time I publicly articulated this distinction between what I call a success orientation and a faithfulness orientation.
yes.
And it's important to understand that I am not opposed to success. Tom Morris, again, our good friend, has amazing books on success.
Success.
And he keeps telling me, he's like, dude, stop beating up on me. And it's like, no, you approach it the right way, man. But the distinction I drew in that TEDx talk, which is available on YouTube, if anyone wants to watch it, and then really unpack in this book, is that ultimately, because we are finite, because we're going to die, because there are limits to what we can pull off in the world, because we all can't climb Mount Everest, we've got to then realize risk attends any choice that we make, because we can only make some choices in the absence of others, right? So if I choose, I've been married to my wife now for 22 years, I think it is. But when we got married, effectively what we said to each other was, hey, I'm going to take the risk of spending my life with you, recognizing that there are other people I could spend my life with, right? If this, my dad used to tell me, don't ever think like, oh, I can't ever live without her. He's like, no, of course you could. Because if you can't live without her, there's no risk in marrying her, right? Like point is, I'm willing myself into this relationship because there's other things I could will. When I went to grad school, well, I could have gone to med school, could have gone to law school. Should have founded a company. Like there's lots of options. So when we make choices, it's not that we choose what is obvious. It's because nothing's obvious that choice is required. And in that moment, I suggest there are two fundamental value orientations that can be at play. One, we could choose success as our model. This is what our society has praised. It's what it has recommended. And, it comes with some good outcomes, likely to lead to some checking off of boxes that you thought were important. You really, really, really want that Porsche? Well, go be successful, buy a Porsche, right? The problem with the success orientation is, I think, threefold. One, it inevitably says that achievement as an external standard, sometimes I'll refer to it as the applause from the crowd, right? That becomes essential to the value of your existence. So I don't just have a successful company. I am either success or failure. My identity, my existence becomes narrated in terms of, did I pull off the checklist of stuff that I set out to do? And the problem, number two, is if we understand ourselves that way, there will come a time, usually it's in middle age, though it might be slightly before or after, where we start saying, I did everything I set out to do. My check boxes are all full. Now what? I feel empty. This didn't give me what I thought. Porsches, it turns out, as cool as they are, like it's just a car. I mean, like we end up realizing that being successful does not necessarily yield some sort of fulfillment, contentment, and joy. And the alternative is we didn't check off all the boxes. Well, I never made it through to my PhD. I never got that thing. I never even got the car. I'm driving a beat up Toyota. Like whatever the situation, we now either are successful and the threat is a kind of emptiness because it didn't satisfy, or we are failures, in which case now we have a whole different kind of problem in our middle age, right? And so what I want to recommend is that the point has to be, go be successful. Don't be defined by it. We're gonna fail. Don't be wrecked by it. And how is it that we can avoid being defined by success and wrecked by failure? And that's the third thing, is we can recognize that success almost always, not always, there are exceptions, but almost always invites us to be assholes, because we start realizing what really matters is checking those boxes, my relationship to other people necessarily becomes simply instrumental ways of making that occur. So I think, well, look, my selfhood, my meaning is not connected to the car I drive or how successful my company is. I really don't think that being successful or being a failure in certain ways determines me. And I also think assholes probably are sucky humans and we should avoid being that kind of person. What's the alternative? My alternative is faithfulness, which says risk is real, but you've got to pick a direction. So will you start that company? Will you enter that relationship? Will you walk away from an opportunity? Will you decide to take that trip? Whatever the thing is, you're taking a risk because you're leaving other options unexplored. But that direction will ultimately be the periods of your life that respond to the questions that motivated your action. And that's where I think faithfulness as risk with direction is not about checking boxes. It's about constantly being invested in becoming the kind of person I hope to be. And the example I sometimes give is, hey, you want to go be a serial entrepreneur? Let's say you want to found 3 companies, exit at, 5 million evaluation on each one of them before you're 35. Well, there's some boxes. We can check them, right? And again, God bless people who are doing that, right? I have no issue with the actions we take. It's the value relative to it. But
and
think about it.
And
right, it's an and versus but. You can do both. But think about it. The difference in getting that Porsche or exiting that company or making the million, think about the difference in that and, fatherhood or friendship or mentorship. It's not like, oh my goodness, I had the greatest fathering day ever 2 weeks ago. It was a fathering win. And my son went to bed. He's 14. He hugs me and he said, Dad, you're amazing. I love you so much. I walked down the stairs. I kissed my wife, packed my bag, and abandoned my family because I'm going out on the high. That should trouble us. But if the point is just success, just being, well, I am a good father. Now I don't want to mess it up. So I'm going to leave my family. That's not how it works. So my suggestion is becoming. I'm always only becoming a better father. I'm becoming a better husband. I'm becoming a better professor. I'm becoming a better philosopher. And that's what I think far too often leaders don't get.
You mentioned earlier humility, hospitality, gratitude. I love here on page 84. I've been a drummer for many years. I was a session player for a while and toured widely with various groups. Accordingly, I've spent a lot of time around professional musicians, the very best of them, like the very best of athletes, the very best of leaders, the very best of craftspeople, and so on, are those who first recognize that they are not yet perfect. Excellence, and by the way, our tagline is maximizing excellence, like ethics, is about continued faithfulness, not finished success. And I lead with that quote because earlier I mentioned how comprehensive faithfulness is. And in reading your book, I started listing when you got me really thinking about faithfulness, and I started listing the complexity of faithfulness and fidelity, loyalty, constancy, devotion, trueness, true-heartedness, dedication, commitment, allegiance, adherence, dependability, reliability, trustworthiness, accuracy, fairness, justice, truth, authenticity.
Yeah.
Those, and as leaders, and I, even in our executive coaching programs, we talk about being a conscious leader and being intentional. And in doing so, it requires these impeccable agreements. It requires you to be unarguable about the truth. And it requires you to be encouraging with others. And so I love how you positioned faithfulness to achieve ultimately that you dive into is that finitude and that legacy. But the in-between, let's talk about the sandwich. Let's talk about the in-between, okay? The meat, the lettuce,
Mm-hmm.
these ingredients that go into this. You mentioned being and becoming, but
Yep.
you dive into joy and hope,
Yep.
these ethics, humility, excellence. And then you talk about something. And by the way, because you position this in the outdoors, in
Yeah.
nature, and the setting of this book truly, I guess for people like me that I get it.
Mm.
I find and I connect and I am energized deeply by being connected with nature in so many significant ways. And the way that you set this geography in the book and you allow us to travel with you out in the open and out in mountains, and
Mm.
you talk about finitude in a way, you represent it by the embers of the fire.
Yeah.
That was profound. And
Appreciate
you
that.
actually did it in such a beautiful, unique way. So I want you to talk about the middle of the sandwich
Yeah.
here, the ethics, and
Right.
dive into
Right.
some of those and how they absolutely play a role.
Yeah. So, well, thanks for the kind words about the setting. My wife, again, as a marketing director and also a beach lover, always wants me to say, whenever I talk about this book, this is not a book exclusively for people who like sleeping on the ground and think tents are preferable to Airbnbs. It is intended to be something that speaks from my own lived experience and
Yeah.
invites others to figure out what their lived experience needs to say.
Mhm.
So for others, I told somebody the other day, I was like, all kinds of reasons might attend the fact that we can't get literally to the outdoors or can't get to, those grand vistas we wish we could see. It might be the case that we, have certain types of disabilities. It might be the case that we are at a stage in our life where, taking days off just isn't going to happen. It might be the case that we have children with special needs. There's all kinds of things that might be the case.
Right.
And yet, I love the fact when my friend Wendy Farley, an amazing theologian, says sometimes finding beauty in the world is premised on the idea that you are willing to be 30 seconds late walking into the office just to let the song finish before you get out of the car.
I love it.
And isn't that awesome? Right.
I love
I
it.
love, I think that's exactly right. Like the point of this book, the meat, as you say, or for the vegans out there, the hummus, and tempeh in the middle.
Right.
I live near enough to Asheville to have lots of those friends. It's important to understand that the point of the book is not, hey, how do you find faithfulness? Go camping. Well, that's not right.
No,
How do you overcome success? Go fishing. Well, that can't be the case. It's instead meant to be, what is it that existential philosophy, these philosophers who have spent their lives thinking about what it means to live well, what is it that they have to teach us? What is it they have to say to us, to invite us to think about when it comes to getting out of bed in the morning and being okay, right? I told somebody the other day that maybe the big lesson of the book, and maybe this is just my southernness coming out, but it's basically being able to say, even when things are not okay, I'm
Mhm.
still good, right?
Mhm.
Like, but that good is not, my bank account is fantastic. I've got exactly what I've set out to do in life. Everybody's healthy in my home. Those are things certainly we hope are the case. And I do talk about the fact that I think when we start thinking about these issues of finding joy and hope and excellence in our own life, it inevitably opens on to trying to do that in broader social ways, right? That we then should think about justice and think about social access and think about, inviting our neighbors to also thrive in the communities that we find ourselves in. But it's even when things suck, like, are you okay? And what I think being okay looks like is not some, claptrap, just positive psychology sort of model. It's about this deep anchored awareness that even though on a long enough timeline, everyone will die, death here does not have to be some morbid, difficult thought. It actually can be that which spurns me to realize, well, hell, I'm not dead yet. What can I do today? Right? It's Kierkegaard, who the title of the book, Camping with Kierkegaard, he's just a 19th century Danish philosopher who is central to what I do, but no one needs to know who he is to be able to make sense of the book. But he has a great line where he says, we must avoid being done with life before life is done with us. Mm-hmm. And this is basically what Thoreau says when he says at the end of our lives, we hope not to look back and realize we've not yet lived. Right? Mm-hmm. It's this idea that all the great love songs understand loss is part of the love now. Like these don't get fully wedded or fully torn apart from each other. And so the ethics that I try to display is not, hey, do this, don't do that. Here's 5 plans for success. It's what would it look like to learn from the lilies, from the birds, from the fish, from the mountains? What would it look like to learn how to be silent? It doesn't mean just not speaking. It means, can I deeply understand that listening is in fact necessary for truth seeking, right? Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, lots of leaders are bad listeners, where they're not actually very good leaders. Which is
an absolute needed competency to be a great leader.
Good leaders must be good listeners, right? And if we learn silence, Kierkegaard says, we also then maybe learn obedience. Now, that's a weird one because obedience can sound very antithetical to our individualist culture, right? But what he means by obedience is not, just do what someone else tells you. I'm too much of a Rage Against the Machine fan just to be okay with doing what they tell you. Instead, it's more obedience understood as the idea that ultimately you are not the author of everything that will be part of your existence, right? We can do a lot. We can determine a whole bunch about how our lives plays out. But at the end of the day, the most essential things about us, that we are vulnerable and that we are relational, is not up to you. And that's where we've got to be obedient to who we are as the kinds of beings we are.
You talk about finding the flow, adaptive attunement, and you'd also talk specifically about being fully present, paying attention, those things. Absolutely. Resilience. Yeah. Being resilient in this state of being. And again, being to become and becoming.
So, I mean, adaptive attunement is an idea I get from my friend Aaron James, wrote a great book, Surfing with Sartre. He also wrote the book Assholes, from which I get kind of my enemy of the book is the asshole who thinks that she is, or he, she, whatever, is entirely entitled to special circumstances that then make them immune from critique from others, right? They are now invulnerable and non-relational. That's the
ego.
And that's the problem, right? And the worry is we are not adaptively attuned. In other words, we don't change and flex with circumstances, which fundamentally means that in order to take seriously our vulnerability, we've got to take seriously our embodiment. And our embodiment is something I remember giving a leadership workshop for a group of mid-managers at a company I won't mention. And we were sitting around the table and I'm listening to them. What are the things that you like? How is it that people get frustrated? How do you know that people on your teams are not, really finding joy? They're not feeling great about things. Like, how do you get that feedback? And every one of them mentioned, annual reviews, basically paperwork, the evaluations that these people fill out.
Performance management.
There you go. And I said, when was the last time you had lunch with them?
Yes.
And it was sort of like perplexing because, we have our own dining room. And I was like, so don't think that you are adapting to what comes if it turns out you've removed yourself from the embodied location of the team you're claiming to lead, right? And so attunement is then saying, if I learn to adapt to what comes, that only happens because I'm fully invested in it coming. Doesn't mean I can't be surprised, right? A lot of surprise happens. A lot of trauma occurs. It is real. And yet, in the midst of difficulty, can I remain adaptive to maximize excellence given the limits that I face? And can I be attuned to the fact that I probably am going to miss more if I'm not invested in listening and invitational to others, right? If I'm an asshole, I'm necessarily surrounding myself with people who are going to build my ego because that's the only thing that I can make sense of as value. And unfortunately, and I mean this with all due snark and yet seriousness, you'd think, well, this is why we shut down assholes. This is why we don't let them, get leadership positions. No, this is why we actually invite them to be the keynote speaker to every one of our business conferences. Right? We don't respond and say, wow, like you've got a really successful company. You're an asshole, man. No, we're not interested in money at all costs. Appreciate it. We're going to look elsewhere because there's plenty of other people who are also successful who model a different way forward. The problem is we're so uncomfortable with making that commitment. And I talk about it in passing in the book. Universities are close to my heart. I've spent my life teaching at them. And one of the problems I have, and this again is a real leadership point, is that universities across the board now, whatever kind they are, community colleges, research universities, whatever, they all brag to be inviting people, their students, to get real world experience, right? Now, on the one hand, who possibly could object to real world? Like, no, I'm good with fake worlds. I mean, it's a nonsense idea to begin with. But the more dangerous thing is what it actually does relative to inviting us into a success logic without our realizing it. If we think the real world is some stable existing thing, and the point of education is just to gain experience to be good at that stable existing thing, well, we know nice guys finish last. The humble people don't get invited to keynote. Like our model, it's not, personal, it's just business. Everything about that quote unquote real world is encouraging us to have a value set antithetical to our basic humanity. Yes. And no wonder it wrecks our societies. No wonder we have lots of rich people with more poor people also, right?
The opposite of that truth is morality.
Yes. What would it look like if we said, go be successful, but remember, you're not better just because you're really rich. And so think about it. Universities, instead of saying real world experience, they say, we're going to give you tons of internships, tons of experiences to give you a variety of opportunities to think about things. Why? Because we need you to decide what world should be real. It literally is contingent. It could look differently, but that's not what we teach them.
And I agree, Aaron. And I also agree that, where we plant the ability to open our youth and our teens and our young adults to getting to know themselves deeper and better, that self-awareness, mastering their self-awareness truly supports the ability to step into these new opportunities that are going to open them to these situations and circumstances that require morality, that require ethics, that require this to become, you say it in the book, you say morality also requires practice. It has to embody as a habit that gives rise to doing the right things as a normal fact of our lived action. And it evolves, if I may say so. It definitely has growth and learning to it. So absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more.
I was once giving a keynote talk to a bunch of banking VPs. And it was lovely, you know, some amazing people in the room. I don't know, maybe 100 people there or so. I don't remember exactly. And the whole point of the talk, like I mean this sincerely, the whole point of the talk was simply to say, what assumptions do you not pay attention to because you take them for granted? What would happen if we brought them to visibility? And so what I did was I had spent time reading all the literature internal to the companies. I had, you know, looked at their mission statements. I had, you know, and I had put together like these different things like, okay, let's see what you say about yourself. What assumptions, what values are actually betrayed by what you say about yourself in contrast to what you think you should say about yourself, right?
Which is climate and culture. Yes.
This is climate and culture. This is what does trust involve. This is, you know, if we're going to be leaders, don't just be repeating what everybody else does and calling it new. And this guy on the front row, he was actually a VP of wealth management at one of these banks. And, you know, God bless him. He raised his hand and he asked a great question. He said, you seem to be acting like capitalism is not just the way the world works. That's just the real world, man. So everything else that you're saying, it just seems to me like a bunch of philosophical nonsense, blah, blah, blah. And I said, sir, I've said nothing about capitalism one way or the other. Like, notice we're starting now to hit that point where we don't like what we start seeing about ourselves when we pay attention to what we normally ignore, right? And so it sounds to me, I'm not a therapist, but it sounds to me that you're bristling at the awareness that these things don't have to be assumed, but you are saying, damn right, they've got to be assumed, because if they're not assumed, I've got to own a moral question that I'm unwilling to own. And I said, man, my only issue is to invite you to realize this. Given capitalism, given the way it plays out, and by the way, there's lots of versions of capitalism, etc. And I said, but given the way that plays out, you have to realize with every behavior that you engage in, you're saying, this is the world I want to leave to others. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm not saying it's good. I'm just asking you to own that power. And he was like, this is ridiculous. That's just the way the world works. I was like, no, that's the way you've allowed the world to work. Now, I recognize this is the kind of stuff that makes parents nervous when they have their their kids come to my classes. Because, wait a minute.
You created for them. This is where that tunes in and taps deep into their fear. There's threat there. There's loss there. There's something that's happening there.
Well, and think about it. Why is it we are so insistent on this narrative of the real world?
Yes.
It's because, and I mean this sincerely, because I wrestle with this now at 46 with a 14-year-old son and looking back on my life. And, you know, there's a lot of stuff I'd do differently if I had it to do over. And I talk about a bunch of that in the book. But it's important to realize, like, look, if I take myself up at 46 and don't say, wow, I wish I could do things different. Why don't I invite my son to live into a world where he actually could, right? Most people think, oh, I'm in my 40s or 50s or whatever. How can I make sure that the choices I've made and the life that I live and to be honest, what Coleridge called, you know, lives of quiet desperation that we all live, how can I make sure that nobody gets to challenge this life as anything other than the goal? Because if it becomes a question mark, I've got to own the fact that maybe I'm not as happy as I want people to think I am, because then it's going to F up my Instagram followers, right?
And effectiveness is the goal.
And the whole point is, if I've pulled off a bunch of people thinking I'm super, super, super happy and I don't have to wrestle with it, I've won. Success continues to triumph. And that will only sustain us for so long, right? And it's no wonder that our kids, and again, I teach these people's kids when they come to college, which I'm sure there will be comments saying, that's why I'm not sending my kid to that school. But the problem is, I see the kids saying stuff like, I don't want this. I mean, it's interesting. The generation right now, is it Generation Z or whatever they call it? Like, they are not interested in buying houses. They all believe they'll never have Social Security. So most of them don't think retirement's even a thing they'll ever do. They are deeply opposed to certain types of things like, getting married younger. Like, nope, I got to go experience my life before I settle down and become my parents. Like, what is it we've done where our kids look at us and say, I don't want that, right? And sure, there's going to be some generational stuff, and the Beatles were rejecting people, and then Led Zeppelin and whatever. But at some level, we've got to say, am I okay with whom I'm becoming? Because who I'm becoming, this goes to your Embers example, who I'm becoming will resound for years and years and years after I'm gone. Because the world I will have said yes to is the world others will now be handed as the real world and have to navigate. What if I gave them a world that was a little bit more open, a little more contingent, a little bit more compellingly devoted to kindness? My son and I have a thing whenever I drop him off to school, which he does not let me do very often, I've got to admit, because apparently he doesn't like the fact that he'll get out of the truck heading into school in 8th grade, and I will yell, Atticus, 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 please don't leave me. No, like, he gets very, very annoyed. He doesn't like my music choices, which get played very loudly upon leaving the car. But whenever I do take him, we have this little mantra where I'll say, Atticus, who loves you? And he'll say, Mom and you. And then I say, what do we care most about? And he says, that I am kind. And I said, what do we not really care about? And he says, that I am rich. Do I hope that he's financially secure? Heck yes. I'm teaching him investment issues at 14. He's already got a brokerage account. We are very privileged and blessed to have opportunities to make those things happen for him, right? But it's also the case, if he ever thinks, and I'm better than that guy because my bike is newer or because I get a car at 16, or that would be the biggest failure I possibly could have done as a father, because I gave him a world that said, doesn't matter about vulnerability in relationships. All that matters is, hey, look out for yourself, make a bunch, can't take it with you. So absolutely just blow it, use people as tools. And I refuse to let that be the legacy I want to leave him, And this is where students respond.
I love this. And I want you to talk about hope, because you talk about it in the book. And I love how you position subjective and objective hope, and you speak specifically to it. And what's beautiful about it is that it absolutely is an attribute that's organically, naturally within us. And we've never been lessoned or learned or taught to be able to optimize it in ways that really allow us to be at our highest and best, and be resilient when there are situations and circumstances that create feelings, right? Because those emotions and those feelings are that energy in which we either react or respond. And so talk about hope, because it's very powerful in this process.
Well, so I've got a chapter on hope, as you know, and it's anchored in some stories about fishing.
Yes.
And it's also the most explicitly religious chapter of the book, though I talk about religion and my own religious identity as a thing that in no way is encouraging others to explore that particular direction. It's just, again, just like with camping, me saying, hey, if I'm not being honest about where I find myself in relation to these questions, I feel like I'm positioning myself on top of a mountain looking down into the valley, telling people, what to do. And this book is instead about me trying to do the best I can to walk through a forest. But if I'm not honest about where I find myself, I think it's all, again, it's a 5-step motivational speaking tour.
Right.
It's not actually philosophy, right? So, which is funny. The book did not do well with a lot of big presses when my agent was working to pitch it, and they kept coming back saying, we've got enough self-help books. And I was like, man, I don't think this
Oh,
book's
wow.
really self-help.
No.
But it speaks to, we don't have categories, right? Because our success culture is thinking reflectively, thinking about hope and joy and happiness and faith. Oh, the only way we know how to market that is as self-help, internal to individualism and a success logic, which is deeply problematic. Anyway, so what do I do with hope? I argue in the book that there are 3 different kinds of hope, and it is the most technical chapter of the book. It's still accessible, I hope, baboomshing, but it is a little bit more complicated. And the reason for that is because the architecture of this book, this chapter on hope, is chapter 8. And the architecture of the book is actually, it tries to start super accessible, sitting by a campfire, and then it walks us into the woods, and the chapters get progressively a little bit more challenging, and they culminate with this chapter 8, which is a little bit more philosophically heavy. And the idea is that's the end of the climb when we're the tiredest. And I was trying literally to make the book kind of model that sort of arc. And then chapter 9 is aphorisms. That's us sitting on top of the mountain where now we're getting our breath and eating a protein bar.
Yes.
And then chapter 10 is all about coming back down the mountain, right? And we're back at the campfire. So it has a rationale and a symmetry. But I think there are 3 kinds of hope. And here I draw this from different philosophers. There is subjective hope, objective hope, and what I call eschatological hope.
Yes.
So subjective hope, the fancy word is existential, but no one needs to think about that. Subjective hope is the idea I can have discrete hope for particular outcomes in my future. And these are good. So all 3 hopes I want to say yes to, right? It's just that which one becomes the main hope in our lives. So I hope this afternoon that I have a nice meal with my parents. I hope tonight that my son has had a great day at school and he comes home, we practice drums together. I hope that tomorrow I have a great day of teaching. Like, I can have other hopes. I hope that my wife and I see our 50th wedding anniversary together. I hope that camping with Kierkegaard really does, find some traction with the world. Not because I want a bunch of money, but because I want these ideas really to have the impact I think they could have, right?
Yes.
So these are subjective hopes. Excuse me, I'm backwards. This is objective hope, right? I have an object that I want to achieve this. So I'm getting that object. I sell 10,000 copies, check. Great day in class, check. Good things. I just think these are logistics, right? And so if we think about them in terms of logistics, which all leaders have to think about, then I hope not to have a supply chain problem with my rollout. So deal with the logistics. They're great. Objective hope is about obtaining the objects that make the logistics that navigate the world a little bit more compelling. Subjective hope, and I apologize for getting them backwards. Subjective hope is where I say, but the only way that I hope for something to happen tomorrow is because I've also got this subjective orientation that I have tomorrow. Like the fact that I go to bed tonight is because I'm planning on waking up in the morning. And I'm not really using that as my goal for tomorrow is to wake up. My goal tomorrow is to teach a good class, but I can only teach a good class tomorrow because I have a tomorrow. And so this subjective hope is the idea that I am oriented toward a future as narrated by what I claim to be worth my objective hope today. Right? I narrate tomorrow as exciting because I'm going on vacation, or as because I've got to go take the ACT. Like, whatever I'm doing today to narrate the objective hope for tomorrow is impacting how I take myself up subjectively as having a future.
It creates that energy. And with leaders, for me, I teach and I coach managing our energy, 2 priorities. And
think about it.
Yeah.
If you've got a leader who, has these sales goals or targets or business expansion models, where all awesome things, objective hopes.
Hopes. Yeah.
The subjective hope would show up as, are your employees excited about the tomorrow where they still work for you?
Exactly.
Right? Like their orientation toward the future, is that something that is making them want to be invested in those same objective outcomes?
Engagement.
That's right. Are you concerned with there being humans?
Enjoyment.
Or are you just concerned with there being tools for obtaining, this set of goals? Eschatological hope, which is the tricky one, is what I'm recommending as maybe worth thinking through together, maybe orient ourselves there a little more. This is what we might call hope against hope. This is hope for the impossible, right? Logistics, you shouldn't hope for impossible stuff at the level of objectivity, right? I hope tomorrow to flap my wings and fly to the moon. That's a bad hope because logistically I'm going to be disappointed. But eschatologically, which is this term that has to do with the idea of the kingdom of heaven, like what would the kingdom of heaven look like? Well, it's probably going to look a lot better and a lot different than what today looks like for me and you. So how can I live anchored in this hope for an impossible future? My example is Martin Luther King, who says, I have a dream where X, Y, and Z will occur. But X, Y, and Z were not logistically possible if we just do this policy today. It was him saying, there is a different future, a different world we can make real. And the only way that we get there is because we today decide to name it as possible for us. But it's possible under the guise of impossible if we stay where we are. So social justice, radical joy. My goodness, we see this stuff in all kinds of stories that come out of real traumatic situations. Viktor Frankl has the book Man's Search for Meaning, where he talks about, surviving the Holocaust. And in the middle of it, he says, some people had to abandon hope in order to just put one foot in front of the other. Other people had to cling to this eschatological hope because it was the only way that their world was not fully reducible to their current experience. And maybe that's the way to put it. Are we inviting the people in our communities, in our businesses, in our groups, are we inviting them to refuse to reduce what's possible to their current vision, their current experience? And that takes a courageous leader, because it's also a leader humble enough to realize that impossible future might be one where they share the leadership role with me, because I've had to give up some of my power for a world where actual thriving looks different than it does today.
Shared
we don't
value.
like that.
Yes.
Yep. We don't like that. We like the world must look real because I'm winning in the real world. I don't want a different world because that's a world where other people might win and that threatens me. And that's deeply, deeply, deeply sad.
This lived experience and wrapping this up, because wow, I just looked up and I was like, wow. We're almost at an hour, and I could go on with you easily. And
I'm happy to come back anytime.
I'd love to have you back. So all these ethics, the phenomenology, leading into phenomenology and leading into the realization of this legacy.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about that piece.
Yeah. So the book ends. The book ends. We've talked about what opens it. The question, what's worthy of my finitude?
Right.
We talk about the encouragement to think about faithfulness instead of success as the real anchor for identity and value. The specifics that attend that, things like humility, hospitality, gratitude, hope, joy, obedience, silence, etc. And then where the book lands is a chapter where I talk about aging and death.
Yes.
and then a postscript where I bring us back to the campfire. And I tell a story about my dad once had a fire in his backyard, had some family over. And my dad is a long time outdoorsman. I mean, this is a guy who, he's fine. Like, give him a, pocket knife and a piece of rope, and like, he'll be all right in the outdoors. So he put the fire out, went to bed. Next morning, came out, got his shovel, and was cleaning out the little fire pit that he's got in his backyard, and threw the, coals and stuff that now, were clearly all cold, he thought, threw them into the woods behind his house, went back in. And about 15 minutes later, my mom starts screaming, and it turns out that the embers down deep had not gone out, and he had set the forest on fire behind his house. So thankfully, he got it put out, lest any forest rangers start giving me a call. We got it put out. But the idea is, this is the way legacy works. And so what I try to do is end the book by inviting people to compare and contrast mountains and cities, and what I call marks and legacies. So a city, grand, glorious, changes the skyline. It's the destination for most of our vacations. We go to these cities. We want to travel them. That's where culture exists. That's where fame happens. If you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. Our whole narrative of the real world is a city-based model of success. The thing is, on a long enough timeline, like, cities are all gonna collapse. All the buildings will eventually fall, right? And we think like geologic time, like nothing in human history is on that time scale, because it's all so fleeting. Mountains, well, the specific peaks that we currently look out might be different, but the mountains will remain, right? The specific trees might be different. What happens to the biodiversity might be impacted because of what we did in our cities, but the rivers and the mountains will stay. And so the idea is, rather than making a mark, like having front billing at, that awesome club in New York or Chicago, well, that's important. It's a mark. It's logistics. Go do it, right? But marks fade when plaques get taken down, right? Legacies continue like embers to remain hot. Like mountains, they remain stable, because they were never just about a fleeting flash in the pan moment. They were about inviting others to be invested in legacy making. So notice, it's not, I want a legacy where people remember my name. That's not a legacy, that's a mark. And then when the last person doesn't remember your name, gone. A legacy is, did I live my life worthy of my finitude, such that whatever comes, it is the kind of world I wanted to invite others to take up. And that's the hope of this book. It's, to be honest, the hope of I have for leaders. My goodness, our political leadership, wherever we find ourselves on whatever side and vision of society, like, we're not, I think, just surrounded by excellent leadership. We're surrounded by people who are concerned about making enough of a mark to get enough popularity to retain power by narrating the world as really effing scary, so that you've got to continue to isolate, fear, and attack others to make sure that your little piece is not taken. What could it look like if we had real leaders who stood up and said, y'all, this is not just bad thinking. It's not just psychologically probably anchored in really big problems like narcissism. Maybe what we need to do is rethink society as an opportunity for us to invite other people to share the world, marked by humility, hospitality, gratitude, joy, hope. Like, we can do this. Now, is it easy? Oh, heck no, right? Climbing mountains is not easy. Catching big fish is not easy. But as I say in the book, what if we became the people who said, whether or not I catch the big fish, I want to live faithfully as the person who keeps fishing. Mother Teresa said, we are called to faithfulness, not to success. So I'm in good company. I am not as good as these people, but I'm in good company when I'm trying to invite us to shift our perspective a little bit. And it doesn't mean sell your company, walk away, and go on a, soul quest in Tibet. It's saying, nah, run your company, be successful at it. Don't ever think you're better than your employees because you make more. And maybe you could even rethink how you understand revenue streams and, reward models to invite their flourishing as necessitated in your own sense of self. We could do it differently.
Yeah.
We can do it differently.
Yep. I want to leave our audience with this from the book. A life of faithfulness leaves a legacy worthy of our finitude. Rather than encouraging others to be like us, faithful legacies foster space for others to be faithful to what they think matters. It is not about getting others to remember us, but to remember why it matters to live on purpose. It is not about being celebrated as having won the game of life, but about appreciating every day with what Nick Riggles terms this beauty of existence, this beauty that we are here, this beauty of good exhaustion, this beauty of those who have walked the trails before us and now form the cloud of witnesses, encouraging us to keep moving forward. And then you dive into the embers and fires. Yeah. Well written, profound, deeply profound. And I can't say enough about, well, for me, this is definitely going to be homework assignment reading because it has deep value in regards to building, strengthening skills and competencies in leadership, and where we truly are looking at today's leadership being and becoming. So it's not necessarily saying that our leaders of the industrial age are ineffective. It's saying that, hey, let's strengthen and build, and let's shift and be open and vulnerable to realizing that you've got it within you to do this in a way that's really going to matter.
Yeah. And the way I'd put it is, it's not that they're ineffective. They have been mind-blowingly effective at creating a world that is defined by division, defined by radical disparity, defined by animosity, defined by jealousy and hatred, and deep, deep, deep anxiety and fear. And so, look, like, if you can sleep okay at night, with your Porsche and your mansion on the hill, knowing that that's also part of the legacy that you've left, God bless you, right? This is not a book that's meant to be like a, finger pointing kind of critical thing. It's an invitation to say, but we could do it different. What if we tried? And I'm drawing on some philosophers and some experiences in the outdoors to invite us to give it a shot. And thank you so much, Lori, for inviting me to talk about it with your audience. They can, as you've got on the screen, they can absolutely reach out to my website. They can go to my YouTube channel, Philosophy for We Find Ourselves, and anything that I can do for them, be a resource. I'm happy to come speak to their business, to their corporation, their community, their book group, whatever it is. I'm right now deeply, deeply committed to the idea that it's not me who they need to hear from, but these ideas are ideas that I'm happy to be a mouthpiece for, and whatever I can do to invite others to think about it with me sounds great. So thanks so much for inviting me to hike the trails with you today.
Hey, and thanks for sitting by the campfire with me. How's that? Yeah, hang on. I'm going to go ahead and send us into the outro. But I do want to say to our audience, tune in on the 13th. We'll have Marisa Zalabek, and she is going to be speaking on, she is an AI ethicist, by the way, and she's going to be bringing in some great thought leadership around social responsibility and stewardship towards AI, and also talking about conscious capitalism, circular economies, regenerative ecosystems, and again, just that ROI on AI ethics. And I think it's going to be another powerful piece. So looking forward to next week and having her on as a guest. Again, thank you, Aaron. I can't say it enough. I'm very honored and very excited today to have you as a guest.
It was my absolute pleasure. Thanks to everybody for spending the time with us.
Take care. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Maximize Excellence. Visit our events page on our website for details on upcoming podcasts and visit our YouTube channel to listen to past episodes. And remember to ask yourself at the end of each day, did I do my best to maximize excellence today?